Yeah, so thanks for coming on the show today. I learned about you through our friend Sina and his podcast, East is the Podcast. You went on a couple of months ago and you did a really great presentation on the Belt and Road Initiative. And you sort of like did something which I've never seen people do before, which was you took a step back and gave like a historical perspective and like sort of situated it within the history of maritime trade and like land route trade. And I don't think people are really able to fully understand what the Belt and Road is unless they take that kind of historical perspective. I know I felt like I didn't really grasp it until I saw your presentation on that. So I really wanted you to come on and, do a sort of a similar presentation. But also because like a lot of what we know about the Belt and Road Initiative is sort of distilled through like the State Department or the Council on Foreign Relations. So it's like very difficult to parse fact from fiction. And also I wanted you to talk about like Chinese investment in Africa because it's part of that development project as well. And it has its own set of myths surrounding it, which, are also very hard to parse through. So,
no, thank you again for having me. I mean, all of these are really important. And for me, having grown up in East Asia, I feel very connected to this kind of what's China happening in Africa because it's not just, I can recognize it in many ways. And, the first thing that really alerted it to me was when I was traveling to Ghana a decade ago when I really started my music work on the continent. And I remember the flight there was mainly people from China and me. And I said, this flight's very Asian going to Africa. I assumed there would be more people from the West and more people from Europe and Africans on the flight, but it was a flight with predominantly Asian people on it. And I just thought, okay, something's happening here. This is my world that's interacting with Africa. And so I've been following this for a very long time. And of course, I grew up with, infrastructure being built in East Asia, seeing it from the 90s, what our cities that I grew up in were, Manila, Singapore, Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, and then seeing them today. So, I hope I can give a perspective with an upbringing in Asia, as well as someone who works frequently, at least before the pandemic, very frequently on the African continent. So before I think we start with BRI or China and Africa, what I really want to do is another thing I find that's really missed in all the commentary around this is just a basic history of infrastructure investment around the world. It's not something brand new, right? So the Chinese are not the first country to go to another part of the world and build infrastructure or to make loans for infrastructure. This is not, there are things that are obviously, real differences between them, but let's just take you back and just go through a short history of this. So till today, the biggest infrastructure investment project that was ever done was the United States Marshall Plan in Europe. When they rebuilt Western Europe, it was done through a series of loans, also grants, but mainly through grants, but also loans. And the loans were long-term, 40, 50, 60-year loans on low interest rates. So people might not know this, but Britain paid off its last loan to the United States for the Marshall Plan after the Second World War in 2006.
Manufacturing industry had to get along as best they could with only half the steel they needed. And food production was barely two-thirds of what it could have been. Without material and financial aid from abroad, the European nations faced complete collapse. To save Europe from this disaster, General George C. Marshall, the United States Secretary of State, in 1937 made a dramatic appeal to the people of Europe. If they would work together, the United States would supply the money for food and raw materials essential to recovery. full implications of this proposal, in Paris, the foreign ministers of Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France met to discuss Secretary Marshall's plan for restoring stability and peace to the nations of Europe. But though the representatives of France and Britain were eager to accept America's offer, the Soviet envoy Molotov immediately opposed the plan and quit the meeting. Nevertheless, 16 of the three democratic nations quickly banded together to work out their economic requirements and to devise an integrated common program for restoring their economic health. At Paris, they set up a permanent body which was to be called the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. One of the functions of OEEC is to review and clear each nation's requirements for financial aid from the United States. And soon requests started coming in.
Right. So the Marshall Plan was the United States' way of rebuilding post-war Europe, building it with infrastructure. They did it through a series of grants, but as well as loans. The loans were long-term, 50, 60, 70 years. And people might not know this, but the last loan that Britain paid to the United States for the Marshall Project, for the Marshall Plan, 70 years later was in 2006. And so those are long-term loans with low interest rates of about 2.5%. Okay, so, and the thinking behind the Marshall Plan was, what good is a devastated, forget low income, no income Europe with no industry, no market to the United States? Who are we going to sell our goods to? Who are we going to trade with? This makes absolutely no sense to have a devastated Europe that is our chief trading partner. We're not selling goods to Africa and Asia. They're just coming out of being colonies. We're selling our goods to Europe. That was the American thinking, right? Yeah. And just to allude to what I'm going to talk about later about China and Africa, the Chinese very similarly looked at Africa and said, and I'm not comparing Africa to like post-World War II Europe, but Africa severely lacked
but this is a comparison that I see a lot, is that the Belt and Road Initiative is like very similar to the Marshall Plan.
It's very similar, and let me tell you, there's the terms, the Chinese terms, for example. The Senegalese president came out last year, and he said, I personally in Senegal prefer these Chinese loans because they're long-term, 50, 60 years, and guess the interest rate? 2%, the exact same as the Marshall Plan. The exact same thing, right? So the Chinese looked at Africa and said, what good is an Africa that lacks infrastructure, lacks a market, lacks a middle class, lacks people that can buy our products? We would rather have a continent that has the infrastructure to ferry our products to market, as well as has the people with the incomes to buy our products. Right? This thinking is very similar. You develop a place to sell products to do business with it, right? So that's one thing I want to point out, is that was one of the first infrastructure projects. And in today's money, the Marshall Plan was $80 billion in investment. I don't believe the Chinese have reached $80 billion worldwide as yet. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure they haven't. And the second infrastructure I want to talk about, and this is really important to understand because I think people too often disconnect China from the whole of Asia. What China did is not very unique from what the rest of East Asia did when we all developed in the 80s and 90s. The strategies that were in place were very similar. Literally, it was Asia developing Asia. It was very different to Europe. Europe developed via colonial competition. Everyone was competing against each other. And, it's not like France made a lot of money and then said, we're going to build a railroad in Germany. No, that was not happening. They were literally fighting world wars over this. Whereas in Asia, the idea was when one country got rich, so the first country was the Japanese, again, because of American investment after the war there. Japan started investing greatly in Asia, started investing greatly in Asian infrastructure, financing infrastructure. They helped build a lot of the public subway system and SkyTrain system in Thailand. They built a lot of infrastructure around Asia as well. They invested greatly in China. And it was a case of when every time an Asian country got rich, they would invest in another country. And then when that country got rich, it would invest in another country. And that's how Asia developed. We invested in each other. We went to each other. We built infrastructure. We built markets. We built middle classes. And we started trading with each other. And that's how it's one of the biggest circulations of regional wealth in history, the East Asian development. So this idea that, what are the Chinese doing? They're going out into the world, they're building infrastructure. I find it shocking, especially when I hear it said in American press, I just think, they probably learned a little bit from your own Marshall Plan about what they're doing. And they definitely learned from the East Asian experience of investing in each other and believing that this is the best way to develop. And so to me, it's not about China in the world. It's not about China and Africa. It's about East Asia in particular in the world, and East Asia and Africa. Disconnecting those two is folly, especially because so many Chinese companies, they have major investors from elsewhere in Asia. So Sinovac, the vaccine that's, I think, the second most distributed vaccine in the world, the main vaccine that's being used in Thailand. And the reason it's being used in Thailand as the main vaccine is because I believe 20% of the company is owned by a Thai firm. Right? And that's the same thing for a lot of Chinese companies. They're owned a little bit by the Vietnamese, a little bit by the Malaysians and the Singaporeans. And so when a Chinese company goes somewhere else in the world, it's not just China going. It's East Asia. We are making moves. That's what we're doing, So
yeah. But China gets. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So I was just saying, it frustrates me, and people always wonder, Vic, why are you quote unquote defending this? Why are you defending China? I just said because you're not just talking about China. You're talking about East Asia. And also, we should put out the reason we try to clarify these things. This is really important. Is not because we're paid to do so or because we're, propagandists. It's because it's dangerous what's being said. It's literally getting people killed. It's literally like a few months ago, people were getting killed. I was sitting in Thailand in horror watching what's happening, worried about my friends from East Asia who live in New York and things like that. Like, messaging them, be like, you'll be safe. This kind of stuff gets people killed. So let's talk about it really. So let's make sober assessments, historical, adjusted assessments, instead of making grand statements and immediately reacting to things. There's a lot more to this story, and we have erased the East Asian development experience from just people's understanding of the world. And people are understanding, wait, why is East Asia so rich all of a sudden? It's because you weren't paying attention to what we were doing for the last 30 years. It was actually monumental, and so many regions of the world can learn from this. I've written an entire article about what Africa and Asia can both teach each other, especially what Africa can learn from East Asia's development experience. So I just wanted to put that historically in perspective of infrastructure is not something brand new. Infrastructure investment and the thinking behind it is not something brand new. Even the terms, long-term loans for low interest, is not brand new. And we have to understand China within the context of East Asia. If we don't, we're missing the point completely. And we are also just not giving enough credit to the fact that this is an East Asian story, not only a Chinese story. So wherever you hear of China in the world, remember there's a lot of East Asian minds, money backing that. It's not just China. So I want people just to understand that as well. And that's really important to understand when we talk about BRI as well. So I think what I'll do is just pull up I have to use a map to explain, give this kind of historical perspective of BRI. So let me just quickly.
Can I ask a question while you pull up your map? So you say these are long-term loans with like low interest rates, right?
Yeah.
So there have been a lot of contradictory statements I've heard regarding Chinese loans. A lot of people claim that the Chinese loans are just as predatory, if not even more predatory than IMF loans. And there's also a lot of claims that these loans sort of lock countries into a kind of debt trap diplomacy. That's sort of like the phrase that's like really popular now. And the prime example that these people use is that port in Sri Lanka, which was supposedly seized by the Chinese after they defaulted on that loan. But are there any truth to these sorts of claims?
Well, I'm not an economist, nor am I a debt economist, so to talk about it in depth, about the numbers would be difficult for me. What I can say is that there's been some incredible writing and research done. In the Atlantic magazine itself, there was an article published called "The Chinese Debt Trap is a Myth." And it was two American researchers who did a lot of research about that. You can look that up. That'll give you a very good idea. And they especially point to the Sri Lankan port as being one of the biggest myths about this. The second thing I will say is again, if I understand East Asia and I understand the thinking here and I understand what they're trying to do in Africa and elsewhere, I'll be very honest with you. I don't understand the business model of building a country, a port, and then seizing it. That just doesn't make any sense to me. Why would you do that? You spent all this time building a port, cultivating this country as a market, and then you seize the port? That doesn't make any sense to me. Why would you try to do that when you're trying to sell products to a country? Why would you do that to put the country put your name in it with a bad reputation? And secondly, why would you go through the trouble of building a port to seize it? Let me just give you an example about seizing ports. So in Africa, 16 ports in West Africa are owned by one French billionaire. His name is Vincent Bolloré.
Yes.
And he actually he didn't build any of these ports. He seized them. Now, it makes more sense to seize a port you haven't built because you haven't incurred any cost. To me, I personally, I just don't understand. If I understand what was happening in East Asia, in fact, one of my friends, he actually runs a port logistics development company along with his family, and they build ports in Asia. I can't imagine him building a port and then, Thailand going to seize it. It just makes even to him, it makes no sense that they would do this. And if we're actually talking about seizing ports, I actually don't know if the research is correct from the Atlantic magazine about the port in Sri Lanka. Please read the piece for anyone listening.
Yeah, it'll be in the show notes, so we'll drop it in the show notes.
If you read that piece and then you look around the world, and you really have to ask which ports have the Chinese actually seized. The answer is none. And the second thing is, you actually have ports being seized across West Africa by Vincent Bolloré. He recently seized the port in Tema, which is Ghana's biggest port, meant to be an Atlantic hub. Hostile seizing of this port, robbed the sovereignty of this country's over its ports. So if you want to talk about seizure of ports, I think a better model to look at is this French company and this French billionaire in West Africa than virtually anything that I can consider the Chinese have done. I also want to point out that the investment that the Chinese have done around the world pales in comparison to the investment they've done in East Asia. So in Africa, I believe it's about 8 billion, 9 billion. In East Asia, it's 17, 18 billion. And I've lived through Chinese developments happening, right outside in all the cities I live in. I do not know of a single instance where the Chinese seized anything that they built. I'll just be honest with you. Like, I maybe I haven't heard of it, but from everything I've seen the Chinese build in East Asia, or in the cities I grew up in particularly, or in the countries I grew up in, I don't remember a story of them seizing anything.
This is really the only example that people point to when they talk about debt trap diplomacy and like Chinese seizure of anything is this port in Sri Lanka. And it's become like a very common narrative. It's been debunked a few times, including in that Atlantic article. It's just, China, it always acts as the foil to like the US and the West, in that, a lot of the accusations that they lob at China, they're really things that the US and the West do themselves, but they, sort of make these accusations as a way to, sort of hide the fact that they do it themselves. So this seems like another example of that.
I think they seize on certain things that, perhaps where China might slip up here and there and then cast it as this is the whole tell-all of the whole story. I don't think that's actually the case. The only thing I've actually seen is that, in the quest to build so much infrastructure, sometimes there are projects that I have seen that I think, well, does the country actually need that? And that's when you get some infrastructure projects that are not being particularly used very often. And I've seen those being spun as the Chinese have seized it. It's like, no, it just happens to be perhaps an unneeded piece of infrastructure that maybe at one point people thought would have been a great thing to build, but down the road it perhaps doesn't serve the purpose. And that happens all the time. I mean, the Japanese used to build stuff in Thailand that, it didn't work out. And that's just, I'm sure during the Marshall Plan, a lot of stuff was built in Europe that maybe they were like, actually, we shouldn't have built that train line, or we shouldn't have built that factory there. That happens, you live and you learn. But what I want